The Face by the River by Clark Ashton Smith. It was after the commission of the deed, and during his nationwide flight from its legal consequences, that Edgar Silin began to develop an aversion for rivers, and a dread of women's faces. It had never occurred to him before that so many rivers resembled the Sacramento, nor had he imagined that anything sinister could attach itself to the leaning willows and alders along their banks. Now, wherever he went, by some macabre coincidence, he was always coming at afterglow of a sullen sunset to the edge of tree-fringed running waters, from which he would recoil with guilty fright and repulsion. Also, he saw resemblances to the dead woman everywhere in the girls that he passed on the streets of unfamiliar towns and cities. He had never thought, even before he began to see her with the altered vision of enamorment, that Elsie belonged to a frequently encountered type. But now, with observational powers that were morbidly sharpened in this one regard, he found that her short oval face, with its pallor untouched by rouge, her high, faintly penciled brows above eyes of deep violet gray, her full, petulant mouth, or her slender but well-curved figure, were seemingly to be met on every pavement and in every train, streetcar, shop, restaurant, and hotel. Silin was not aware of any consuming remorse for his act in the usual sense of the word, but certainly he had reason to regret it as a piece of overwhelming and irremediable folly into which he had been driven by the goading of some devilish fatality. Elsie had been his stenographer. The propinquity of business association had drawn them into a more intimate relationship, and he had loved her for a while till she became too exacting, too exorbitant in her demands. He was not brutal or cold-blooded. He had never dreamed of killing her at any time, and even when he had tired of her, and even in that last walk at twilight by the river, when she had threatened with bitter hysterical reproaches to tell his wife of their affair, he had not really wanted to harm the girl. His feeling had been a mixture of alarm at the menace to his domestic security and a sudden mad desire to still the intolerable shrewish clamor of her tedious voice. He hardly knew that he had gripped her by the throat, that he was choking her with ferocious fingers. Such an action was totally foreign to his own conception of himself. And when he realized what he was doing, he had loosed her and pushed her away from him. All he could see at that moment was her frightened face, her throat with the visible marks of his fingers, white as an apparition in the dusk, and appallingly distinct in every detail. He had forgotten that they were so close to the river's edge, had forgotten that the water was very deep below the bank at that particular place. These things he had remembered when he heard the splash of her fall, and he also had remembered, with a numb sense of terror, that neither he nor Elsie could swim. Perhaps she had lost consciousness when she fell, for she had sunk immediately and had not risen to the surface again. The whole scene was dim and confused in Silin's mind, apart from that final glimpse of her face on the shore. His flight from California was vague to him also, and his first clear memory was that of a newspaper he had seen the next morning in a neighboring state, with pictures of Elsie and himself above a lurid conjectural description of the crime. The horror of those headlines, in which he seemed to meet the accusing eyes of a vast multitude of people, was branded ineffaceably upon his brain. Henceforth it was a perpetual miracle to him that he could manage to evade arrest. Like most criminals, he felt that the world was preoccupied with himself and his crime, and did not realize its manifold oblivion, its absorption in multiform pursuits and interests. He was stunned by the consequences of the deed, by the break that it entailed with his whole past life, with everything and everyone he had known. His flourishing business, the respectable place he had won in his community, his wife and 2 children, all were lost beyond recovery through something which, as he had soon persuaded himself, was no more than a fatal accident. The idea of himself as a fugitive from justice, as a vulgar murderer in the eyes of the world, was alien and confusing to the last degree. He retained enough wit, however, to disguise himself with a touch of subtlety and to double upon his trail in a manner that baffled the police. He bought some second-hand clothing of the type that would be worn by a laboring man and disposed of his neat tailor-made suit by leaving it at night beneath a pile of old lumber. He allowed his beard to grow and purchased a pair of heavy-rimmed spectacles. These simple measures transformed him from a well-to-do realtor to a socialistic carpenter out of work. In trying to conceal his furtiveness, his perennial fear of observation, he acquired a rough and fierce air that was quite compatible with the role of a discontented workman. Silin was well supplied with money. Even when prolonged security had diminished his fear of arrest, he did not dare to linger in any place. A queer, morbid restlessness impelled him to go on. And always, it seemed to him, there was a willow-bordered river to remind him of the scene of his act, and always there were women who resembled Elsie. The mere sight of a stream, or a girl with a fancied likeness, even in one feature or detail of costume, would send him toward the nearest railroad station. He tried not to think of Elsie, and sometimes succeeded. But any chance resemblance was too much for his nerves. The damnable frequency of such resemblances became one of his chief worries. He could not account for them as part of the natural order of things. Often, with apparitional suddenness and irrelevance, he would remember Elsie as he had seen her in that last moment when her face had emerged from the twilight with such preternatural pallor and vividness. Even when he managed to forget her, there was a sense of some troublous haunting in the background of his mind. He developed also a physical feeling that he was not alone, that an unseen presence accompanied him wherever he went. But at first he did not connect this feeling with Elsie, nor did he associate with her the earliest beginnings of the actual visual hallucination from which he eventually came to suffer. Silin was well aware of his growing nervousness and made desultory efforts to overcome it. He knew, or had been told, that such a condition might lead to insanity. He tried by means of autosuggestion to dismiss the irrational fears and impressions that dogged him in his wanderings. He felt that he was succeeding to some extent, that his haunting obsessions were growing fainter. Then, simultaneously with this, he began to think that there was something wrong with his eyesight. He was troubled by a small, blurred image, somewhat to one side in his field of vision, an image that he could not seize or define, and which followed him everywhere, maintaining always the same position. He could even see it when he lay awake in the darkness, as if it were possessed of a pale luminosity. It occurred to him that the glasses he wore were injuring his eyes, and forthwith discarded them. But the unaccountable blurring still persisted. For some reason other than his natural fear of optical disease, it made him horribly uneasy. But for the time being, he did not think so often of Elsie. Also, he was not quite so afraid of rivers and women as he had formerly been. One evening, in a strange city far from the state he had left, Silin deliberately went for a walk by the shore of a tree-fringed river. He wanted to reassure himself, wanted to feel that he was mastering his old terrors. It was still twilight when he neared the water, that deceptive half-light which alters the position and proportion of objects in a manner so illusory. All at once, Silin became aware that the strange blur in his field of vision was now directly before him instead of at one side. Also, the blur had defined itself to a human face, seen as in some diminished perspective at an interval of vague distance. But the face was unnaturally clear in every feature, and was outlined in luminous pallor against the dark flowing of the stream. It was the face of Elsie, even as Edgar Silin had last seen her. Silin was unable afterward to recollect the circumstances of his flight from the apparition. Any real consciousness of his actions was drowned for a while by a primordial tide of unreasoning terror. When he came to himself, trembling like an ague patient, he was sitting in the lighted smoker of a moving train. He could not even remember where he was going till he looked at the ticket which he held in his hand. He no longer saw the face of Elsie, but even as before, there was a blurred image in his field of vision, perhaps not so far to one side as it had been at first. For several days it was only at twilight that the image became definite, but all the time it was moving nearer to the center of his vision. Then he saw the face at various hours during the day and also at night. It was always pale and luminous. It was detached and disembodied, like a face that has been superimposed on a photographic plate. But the clearness of detail was abnormal. Even at the remote perspective, which it maintained for many days, he could see the horror-widened eyes, the parted lips, and the livid marks of his fingers on the white throat. It appeared to him on the streets, in trains, in restaurants, and hotel lobbies. It came between him and the visages of people when he passed. He saw it in the foliage of trees, and among the faces of actors in the plays or films to which he had gone in the hope of temporary distraction. But at first the haunting was not continual. The face came and went at varying intervals, and left him always with the same paralyzing horror, which would wear off in some slight degree before the next appearance. Silin had never been a believer in the supernatural, but he knew a little about brain diseases and morbid hallucinations. His fear of the dead woman was more than doubled by a fear of madness. He felt that he was unquestionably headed for some sort of lunacy. At first, he tried to reason with himself in the interludes of his panic. Among other things, he went to a public library with the idea of consulting various medical volumes on brain pathology. He did not repeat his visit, for while he was reading one of the pages in a work of this type, the letters suddenly began to blur and fade, and it seemed to him that he was looking through and beyond them into a shadowy gulf, in which swam the face of Elsie. From that time onward, the appearances of the face were more frequent day by day, till the hour came when he saw it continually. For a while he drank soddenly. He sought the anodyne of drugs, but without losing the spectre, even in the ultimate delirium of his intoxication. Then his mind succumbed to a fear that was utterly beyond reason, and he dwelt henceforward in a hell of phantasmal and superstitious terrors. The thing was no longer a mere hallucination. It had come back from the cryptic realms of the dead, from a gulf beyond mortal perception, to freeze his blood and his brain with ghastly intimations of all that is hidden in the depths of death. Perhaps his mind had already given way, for he soon lost the fear of madness in a greater and more abysmal fear of the woman herself and the unknown world into which he had precipitated her by his crime. In his heedlessness of anything but the apparition, he would stumble against people on the street, and he was often in danger from passing vehicles. But in some miraculous manner, like a somnambulist, he would avoid them without ever knowing his peril or his escape. The face was nearer now. It sat opposite him at every table. It moved before him along the pavements. It stood at the foot of his bed through the night time. It was always the same, with widely staring eyes and lips that were parted in an eternal gasp. Silin was no longer conscious of what he did or where he went. It was some automatic portion of his brain which enabled him to continue the daily movements and actions of life. He was wholly obsessed by the image of Elsie. He lived in a kind of mental catalepsy. Held by a dreadful hypnosis, he watched all day in open sun or rain or shadowy rooms the thing that was stamped upon his vision, and he watched it during the night by lamplight or in utter darkness. He slept very little, and when he did sleep, Elsie hovered before him in the vistas of his dreams. It was mostly at night, lying awake, that he became aware of the abyss that lay behind and beneath her face, an abyss in which he could see the slow sinking of dim, macabre forms, of corpse-like or skeleton-like things that appeared always to fall and decompose in unfathomable gloom. But the face itself never sank into the abyss. Silen knew nothing of time. The moment in which he had last seen Elsie was relived by him in a virtual eternity through the perpetuation of her visual image, and he knew nothing of the cities through which he passed, nor the route by which he returned on a later evening, still oblivious of his whereabouts, to the city and the riverside of his crime. He knew only that the face was leading him somewhere to an end which his palsied faculties could not even imagine. He stared about him with sightless eyes. Here, in the dusk, beneath the unheeded willows, beside the unrecognized flowing of the Sacramento, the face drew nearer still. The phantom throat was within arm's length for the first time, even as when he had loosed his fingers from the living throat of Elsie and had pushed her back toward the water in a sullen twilight many months before. Silen did not perceive that he was standing close to the river brink. He saw only the features of Elsie, knew only that her throat was within seeming reach of his fingers once more. It was a mad impulse of frantic fear, of ultimate desperation, which made him clutch at the white phantom, with its changeless eyes and mouth, and the livid, never-fading marks below its chin. He still saw the face for a little while, when he sank beneath the water. It seemed to swim on a fathomless abyss, where human bones and cadavers were slowly drowning in a darkness that was like the deliquescence of the world and of all past years and eras. The face was very close to him as he went down, and then it began to recede in a lessening perspective, and then suddenly he saw it no longer.